welcome to This Explainer. Have you ever felt just completely exhausted by the modern world's relentless demand to stay positive, like hustle hard, expect nothing but the best 24/7? Well, if so, you're definitely not alone. Today, we're exploring a really fascinating contradiction by unpacking a popular YouTube video titled Dark Psychology. It dives into the philosophy of the 19th century thinker Arthur Schopenhauer. Now, on the surface, this guy is famous for being the ultimate pessimist, literally the king of gloom. But as we unpack this source material today, you're going to see how his seemingly grim worldview is actually this incredibly potent antidote to our modern epidemic of anxiety and burnout. It's kind of like a hidden toolkit for living well, precisely because it absolutely refuses to sugarcoat reality.
Okay, let's dive into this. Take a look at the breakdown of the 6 primary human emotions. Do you notice anything striking? We've got sadness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise, and joy. Yeah, 5 out of those 6 core emotions are inherently negative. Only one, joy, is positive. Schopenhauer argued that a lot of what we actually experience as happiness is really just the temporary removal of pain. And when you look at this biological reality, it completely validates that hidden, nagging feeling you might have, that the constant, forced, toxic positivity of our modern culture, it's just deeply unnatural. We are, quite literally, wired to experience the negative.
So to understand why we're wired this way, we've got to look at Schopenhauer's central concept, the will. He defined this as a powerful, irrational, completely blind impulse that drives all physical existence. Now I know that sounds incredibly bleak, doesn't it? Just some irrational force controlling the whole shebang. But here's Schopenhauer's secret weapon for finding well-being. We don't have to just blindly obey this will. By recognizing it, we can actually transcend it. We do this through art, through ethics, and through deep introspection. Understanding the dark, primal psychology of human nature is literally the very first step to freeing yourself from its grip. What's really fascinating is the stark contrast in how we view the world. On one hand, we have the modern expectation. That's the belief that life should basically be this unbroken sequence of positive, good events, and that hardship is just some unfair glitch in the matrix. On the other hand, we have Schopenhauer's reality. He suggested we use a totally different compass. He said we should view the world more like a place of atonement, a penal colony even. Now, hold on, stay with me. I know that sounds incredibly harsh, but think about it. If you expect a 5-star resort and get a flat tire, your whole day is ruined, right? But if you expect a penal colony and get a flat tire, you just kind of shrug and get to work. By aligning our expectations with the actual harsh nature of reality, we stop viewing miseries as these shocking, irregular events. So the absolutely crucial point is perfectly captured right here. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. When you experience a hardship, well, that's the inevitable pain. It's a tangible element you feel directly. But if you're also wrestling with the expectation of, why is this happening to me? This shouldn't be happening. You're just adding a massive, totally unnecessary layer of suffering right on top of it. Schopenhauer's dark philosophy liberates us from that second layer. We accept the pain, sure, but we opt out of the extra suffering caused by our own unrealistic expectations. And this brings us to a highly practical, if slightly unconventional, coping mechanism derived from his work. I call it the consolation exercise. It takes 3 steps. First, acknowledge your misfortune. Second, sit down and journal for 15 minutes. And third, rigorously detail the far worse misfortunes of other people in painful detail. Now, I know, our culture's bias against negativity makes this sound, frankly, kind of gruesome. Usually we just brush things off and say, well, it could be worse, right? But Schopenhauer suggests really meditating on exactly how much worse it could be. It forces this radical perspective shift that shrinks our own immediate suffering right down to size. Which leads us perfectly into our next core topic, the information diet. Because navigating the world with this kind of clarity requires us to be fiercely protective of our own minds. In a world characterized by an absolute addiction to the 24-hour news cycle and endless doom scrolling, we have to look really closely at the opportunity cost of what we're feeding our brains. Just consider this incredibly provocative quote from the man himself. Reading is merely a surrogate for thinking for yourself. It means letting someone else direct your thoughts. It's hyperbole, of course, but it's really useful hyperbole. We so often delude ourselves into thinking that passively absorbing information, whether that's the nightly news or some vapid self-help book, is the exact same thing as gaining wisdom. We waste hours letting third-rate thinkers direct our attention, completely neglecting the vital heavy lifting of thinking for ourselves. And this brilliantly illustrates Schopenhauer's implied formula for useful knowledge.
It highlights a really critical ratio, 1 part raw information to 3 parts critical thinking. Simply inputting data, it's boring and honestly largely useless. Reading for 5 hours is a complete waste of time if you aren't spending 15 hours questioning it, arguing with it, and organizing those truths in your own mind. Pure empiricism without thought is kind of like a mouth boasting it keeps the body alive, but without the stomach to actually digest any of the food.
So I actually want to pause for a second and ask you directly, what is the opportunity cost of your attention? Think about it. Every single hour you spend outraged by the latest bit of trivial news is an hour you could have spent reading something deeply substantive. Or even better, thinking rigorously about meaningful questions in your own life. Schopenhauer reminds us of a very simple, very sharp truth. Life is exceptionally short. The art of not reading, of actively ignoring the general public's temporary obsessions, that's a literal superpower. But when we do finally start thinking for ourselves, we often run right into a trap. What actually blocks us from discovering the truth? Well, it's not the tricky appearance of the world. It's not a lack of intelligence. The massive contrary wind driving our ship off course is our own prejudice. It's confirmation bias. We bind our identity and our egos so tightly to our beliefs that questioning them feels like an actual physical threat. If you want to be a happier person and a clearer thinker, you absolutely have to detach your self-worth from your current opinions. All right, let's move on to our next core concept, solitude and the mind. Let's see how this builds into our everyday environment. To do all this heavy lifting, to detach our identity, to think critically, to digest information, we need the right setting. We need solitude. But today we have this really tragic habit. We stay constantly busy. We're constantly plugged in. And why? Simply because we are deeply afraid of our own minds. We use busyness to outrun uncomfortable emotions and distressing thoughts. But just look at what we're sacrificing when we do that. Schopenhauer wrote, "There's no happiness on earth to compare with that which a beautiful and fruitful mind finds in a propitious hour in itself." The human imagination is capable of inexplicably beautiful thoughts and dreams. It is an absolute tragedy to deliberately build this giant wall of noise and busyness around your own mind just to avoid a little bit of psychological discomfort. We face this constant environmental clash today. On one side, we have the hustle. The intense midday sun, the constant bustle, the Times Square of life where sensory input is just maxed out. In that environment, your imagination essentially takes a holiday. It shuts down. But on the other side, we have solitude. Twilight shadows, silence, maybe a cozy cottage. Imagination thrives when there is less external sensory data to process. Now, it's true that no man is an island, but Schopenhauer's philosophy strongly suggests that no man should be Times Square either. We need that dark, quiet solitude for the mind to truly flourish. And this brings us to a really beautiful metaphor to tie all of these seemingly dark concepts together. I like to call it the rosebush paradox. It perfectly resolves the cognitive dissonance of how such a quote-unquote pessimistic worldview can actually generate profound beauty and resilience in our daily lives. The crucial point really lies in how a gardener operates to cultivate that beauty. First, just visualize a blooming rosebush. Your overall impression is one of beauty and sweet smells, right? Even though the flowers make up just a tiny fraction of the whole plant. But the secret to that beauty is step 3, trimming the dead branches liberally. To make the bush thrive, you have to engage in the harsh, kind of counterintuitive act of chopping away old branches. Schopenhauer is basically teaching us to be ruthless gardeners of our own lives. By accepting the harshness, the pain, the thorns, the need for solitude, the pruning of our ego and our information diets, we actually create the exact space needed for the beautiful moments to bloom. I want to leave you with this lingering thought from Schopenhauer that perfectly encapsulates the hidden optimism tucked inside his dark philosophy. No rose without a thorn, but many a thorn without a rose. It's a powerful reminder that while suffering is a guaranteed part of the human condition, beauty is for sure not. Beauty requires effort. It requires a clear, unclouded mind that simply refuses to be distracted by the noise and refuses to be crushed by unrealistic expectations. Which leaves us with one final question for you to consider as we wrap up this explainer. How do you plan to prune your own rosebush today? What unrealistic expectations, what useless information, what forced toxic positivity do you need to just cut away right now so that your own mind can finally thrive? Take Schopenhauer's paradoxical toolkit, embrace a little bit of the dark, and use it to cultivate your own incredible resilience in this chaotic world. Thanks for joining me, and hey, keep thinking for yourself.